Right. So welcome to Abraham's Whiteboard. I'm Jeremy Fricke and the Education Director at Tri-Faith Initiative. And we're going to be talking quite a bit about evolutionary psychology of religion, which sounds really complicated, but I think you'll get it as we go forward. Abraham's Whiteboard is intended to promote religious literacy by looking at a whole bunch of different topics and different perspectives. And I try to always connect it back to Judaism, Christianity, or Islam in some way. All right, so we're going to go through a few different parts to this. So firstly, I'll announce a couple things. I always will send out a recap after the class with both a link to the video and kind of any resources related. We'll move on to discussing a variety of parts of ways people think about the evolutionary psychology of religion. And then we will talk about how this might apply to us and have a little bit of time for any questions or discussion. Now, I usually don't start with this, because generally I just kind of go into the content. But for this one, for evolutionary psychology of religion, I want to make people aware that some of this might be a challenge, like either the content will be difficult or the approach might just be a challenge to something deeply held. Now, I'm going to make sure that we look at it from a multiple perspectives. And you'll see as we go. All right, so before we get too far in, let's establish a few definitions here. So firstly, when we're talking about evolution and adaptation, we're not talking about the origins of all things. We're not talking about like creation versus evolution or something like that. We're just talking about evolution as the accumulation of adaptations. So the way that people change over time, right, over generations. And then and those adaptations can be any kind of trait. We usually think of genetic traits, and I think most of what we'll be talking about today will be genetic traits, but really anything that is given to the next generation over courses of generations can be considered an adaptation for humans. In other words, how do our traits help us to survive and extend our lineages? So this is kind of a piece of that evolutionary psychology of religion. But let me just ask everybody a question, and feel welcome to either speak up or write in the chat. What are some of the ways that science could interact with religion? Or what are some of the ways that you would like either this class or future classes to look at science and religion?
Evolution has been a big issue with religion and science, if you don't accept it.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to add?
Well, there've always been like blood drives at religious institutions where people get blood and do similar health fairs and things like that. That's all based on science. And
that's true. That's true. I didn't think about that, but that's true. That sometimes religion can facilitate science in a sense in that way, right?
Yeah. I think a lot too of just like how they're both different ways that we try to understand the world.
Yeah, and something I kind of want to introduce right now is one thing to kind of keep in mind is that science really tries to describe how things are right now, exactly right in front of you as materially as possible. And religion often is more about how things should be, or the ideals of how things should be or how things are, or a way to understand the world rather than a description. And we'll go into that a little more as we go forward here. So, is science and religion in conflict? And I'll just read this one. So Glenn Gare, who's a pretty well-known professor of psychology who deals a lot with evolutionary psychology. He says evolution and religion are famously antagonistic, but they need not be. And evolutionary psychology in particular truly does not conflict with religion in any way as far as I can tell. So there are certainly ways that science and religion can conflict. It depends a little bit on on how we interpret science or interpret religion. But they also can work together, or they can kind of just be describing separate things. So Steven Pinker, who many of you may have heard of before, he's also an evolutionary psychologist. He appears on a whole bunch of television shows and things like that. And so really the question, the core question of evolutionary psychology, of religion, is why are Homo sapiens so prone to religious belief? Or really, like, what makes religion so universal in humans? So what is the benefit of studying evolutionary psychology of religion? Now, during this, I'm just going to focus on this evolutionary psychology piece. There is a whole entire other field that has some overlap that's called the cognitive science of religion, which is basically an approach that looks at how religion or religious experiences impact the brain. Like if someone has a mystical experience, how does that impact us psychologically at the moment and afterwards? But that's not what we'll mostly be talking about today. The study of evolutionary psychology of religion could be beneficial for things like understanding religion as something that is universal to all humans. It can also be understood as as a way to materially, or physically describe religion. It can be a way to understand religion as something that is very natural, or scientifically adjacent. And it really, at least to me, it helps to provide a framework to think about how religion is so deeply set in so much of humanity. So just again, this specific class will not answer any questions like what is the nature of God, or can we scientifically prove God or the afterlife, or what the purpose of humanity is. But it might answer questions like, why are religious beliefs and practices so common? Do people have a natural inclination toward religion? Or if religion is natural, what is its material purpose? These things are not exclusive from one another. Those things can be answered in parallel with different ways of looking at the world. So now, evolutionary psychology of religion is at its core, a way of looking at something rather than being some kind of clear description of how things are. So when we go through the,
oh, I'm ready to go.
So when we go through these, think about like, what are the different ways we can understand these things if we look at certain phenomenon around the world. So the core here is there are two primary ways that we can look at the evolutionary psychology of religion. And that is the idea that our genes themselves have evolved to have the capacity for religion, or, you know, that we have some kind of physical genetic type of capacity for religion. The other is that religion is a byproduct, which is that religion is incidental in a way, that it's found between the things that are, you know, scientific or more physical. Most scholars think that the religious component of evolutionary psychology is a mixture of these. That when we look at religions, certain parts are very, very like internal to every single person in the world, and then there's others that are a little more found between the lines. Does that make sense? That clear as mud? Okay. Would anyone like to read this quote by Glenn Gayer?
I can read it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Religions are found across the world, and they function similarly across cultures and across history. Religious practices have provided a basic means for humans to create social groups that extend beyond kin lines in a way that does not exist in any other primate.
Right. So the core here that I really want you to see is the idea that that social groups are so special to humans, you know. And let me check something. So humans have a particular relationship with their community that is very different from the vast majority of animals around the world, right? We have a vision of all of humanity, right? We understand that humans are all humans, and, you know, like, we can imagine people who live in other countries or continents. We can imagine, you know, our religious communities extending beyond our individual institutions, and we can imagine things like you know, our ancestors or the future generations. Those are some things that don't have the same overlap with any animal, any plant. You know, those things are very special to humans, and it seems that religion has some kind of power to really lean in to the ability to do that, right? That there's something about religion that connects us beyond the people so close to us. So this is the primary way that people think about religion as an adaptation, as like a genetic adaptation. So adaptations can be a lot of things, though. As I said before, adaptations can be genetic and physical. They can be cultural, which would be things like a teaching given to future generations. You know, you learn that a certain plant is unsafe, so you teach your kids, and then they teach their kids, and they teach their kids, and it continues. And maybe they learn other plants that look like that are also unsafe. Or certain things can be a combination. And we'll get to a couple examples here also. But I want to talk about one particular thing is the idea of altruism, right? So where does altruism come from? You know, if we're thinking about it very scientifically, why do people care about other people, right? You know, the traditional way of looking at evolution is that the strongest survives, right? And whoever is strongest or most dominant is more likely to reproduce, and that means that the future will have more dominance, right? And you can argue that that might be true of most animals, but what is special about humans in particular, and maybe this is true for other animals also, but there's some level of selflessness. There's altruism, this belief that you should do something for others, right? Even if it puts you below them, right? That you will actually make a sacrifice of your own time or money or resources to benefit others. So this idea is actually hits on both the cultural changes and the genetic changes, because basically the idea here with this chart is that those who are altruistic are going to have a much stronger group, right? Again, we usually think of evolution as really at the individual level, right? That we adapt and the strongest survive at the individual level. But this is a situation where, because humans have such a strong connection to communities around the world and to their immediate communities, the selflessness that they provide to others can be is beneficial enough for that community to do better. So the idea would be, even though we often don't see it in the world around us, the idea would be that if we privilege altruism, if we privilege the idea that helping others is the way for community survival, then that means that altruism grows and wins over time. So a lot of what I just said there comes from an author named David Sloan Wilson, who wrote Darwin's Cathedral. He also wrote Does Altruism Exist? He does a lot of work about people. Why do people do good things? Like at all? Why don't they just dominate everything? That's his focus. But we know that, so religion is not just community. Community is a big part of it, right? Would anyone like to mention some of the things that they would expect to see if you were to call something a religion? What's one thing that you would expect to see? And feel free to answer in the chat or verbally.
Shared belief system. Okay, so some beliefs in what? Why life is important and how to serve others. And I think for many religions, it's about what happens after you die. Like, what's your purpose?
Okay, yeah.
Purpose of existence.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to add any?
Believe in some kind of higher being that you can rely on.
Yeah. Any others? All right. So firstly, I would agree with all of those. Those are really common, and we can always find exceptions to things, but those are all very uncommon. So one of the real cornerstone founders of the idea that religion is a byproduct, at least in part, is Scott Atran, who says here, religion involves a costly and hard to fake commitment to a counterintuitive world of supernatural agents that master existential anxieties. Now he's trying to create a scientific definition of religion, one that he can take from a very outside perspective. But I do notice that a few of you mentioned, I also want to add, before going on too far, that shared texts or stories were also added in the chat, charity or giving, and directions or guidance on how to live. So we'll get to most of those. So the counterintuitive world of supernatural agents, that means that really can be interpreted as like faith in a deity, right? To some extent, faith in some kind of something that's more powerful than you. Master existential anxieties is stuff like death and purpose of life and things like that. And the costly and hard to fake commitment. This is what really branches religion as an adaptation for community and religion as a byproduct, if you will. But the costly and hard to fake commitment is what is the purpose of religious ritual, right? So the costly and hard to fake commitment to these beliefs basically is, to Scott Atran, is to say, this is how we show we are part of the community, right? So if you were to think back to ancient people, you know, in a practical sense, you know, there's a lot of fear, right? Especially as humans, you know, if we think about humanity, you know, we are one of the few animals that has such, honestly, such weak infants for so long, right? I know that seems kind of random, but think about what that means for how we make sure that, you know, our children survive. That requires more community to some extent. You know, when a horse is born, they walk in just a few hours, right? But a child doesn't walk for, you know, half a year-ish. I mean, it depends on the kid, of course. You know, and can't find its own food for a long time, right? So humans recognize that we are to some extent, in a very physical sense, kind of unsafe. You know, we need some level of security. That's partially why we rely so much on communities, whether they're religious or you know, rely on governments, etc. But these religious rituals are designed to ensure that your commitment to the community and to the beliefs of the community is so sincere that you are willing to literally bring yourself lower than you were before. You know, and you know, like I said, scientists would ask, well, why would they basically damage themselves, right? Or why would they put themselves below where they once were? And the idea is, this helps us to create deep and meaningful communities. So part of many functions of religion is to simply be in deep community with the people around us. So the idea of a byproduct, I think the easiest way for me to explain it is the idea of a spandrel. And sorry, let me back up. So Jean, you asked, is it an attempt to make ourselves feel better about ourselves? I think that's valid also, but you'd still ask yourself, why do we take that approach to do it? You know, we can feel better about ourselves a lot of different ways. You know, like I said, we can continuously improve our strength or our intelligence or gather resources or whatever, you know, from a very physical point of view. Putting ourselves in acts of service or in acts of community or loyalty, they don't serve an immediate purpose. They serve a long-term purpose of community building and strength. The spandrel. So the idea behind religion as a byproduct is that we have a wide variety of genetic traits, mostly, that answer a whole bunch of different issues, right? So we have We have evolved to recognize danger. We have evolved to seek out food. We have evolved to do a wide variety of things, or adapted, however we want to describe it. So can you all see my mouse, by the way? Okay. So a spandrel, and maybe some of you know, it's an architectural term. And the idea is, so this is an arch basically here, right? Or two arches, if we look at this circle. And so the idea is that there's a connection point here, there's a connection point here, and there's a connection point here. But what's created is this space and this space is really important for a bridge, right? This space is important because it adjusts the weight of the bridge and makes it more efficient and makes it more effective by that angle. Are you following me here? Okay. So this spandrel here, that's the space. So some theorists, and many of these theorists are not of faith, but I find a lot of beauty in a lot of the approach here. But they find religion within, between the physical parts of us, which I actually find deeply spiritual in its own way. That faith and religion exists sort of between the lines, that in this approach, the religious trait is not its own gene. It is between the lines.
Sometimes some musicians and composers have thought that music was not in the notes, but it was a space between the notes. So it's kind of an analogous. You probably heard that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I think that's a great, another great way to look at it. Yeah, there's beauty in both finding a physical, scientific point or not. There's a lot of beauty in either, I think. So theory of mind, and this one is, I would say, a little more of a challenge to people of faith. And again, this is just a theory. The idea is that, and this is important to a lot of the theories, so I think it's important to go over a little bit. So the idea is that as humans were adapting or evolving, they would see things like rustling in the bushes, and there has to be a decision made when you see rustling in the bushes. You fight, you fly, or you stand still, right? Freeze. So the idea would be that regardless of whether it is an odd breeze or whether it's an animal or another human, the likelihood is that you're going to start questioning, is there something behind the bush, right? So the idea would be that as we become more aware of the idea of agency, or the possibility that something can act outside of ourselves, we're able to see that things like when the clouds move, we see we see that there's force behind that, right? We see things like that, even things like historical events or whatever. We are able to apply the idea that that something is behind that, right? Now, the theologian inside of me says that this actually shows something very important, at least to me, with all of this evolutionary psychology, and that's that this approach shows that there is some sort of physical capacity for religious feelings and beliefs and practices, right? So even if you were to describe that this is why we feel religious feelings, about like a supernatural agent or a god, then that shows that we have some sort of universal capacity to feel those spiritual feelings, So whether that is provided by a god, that is a complete and total option, that these physical capacities can be an important part of our theology, really. Does that make sense? Okay. So before I go on, does anyone have any questions or comments or concerns or about anything I've talked about so far? Oh, Nancy, sorry. Here. I can't hear you. Nancy, you're on mute.
Here. I have always felt like there was just something that was inside of us when we were born that caused us to want to reach out to God or to that being that was stronger than us, or how does that fit in this? What would that be?
Well, I think it kind of would depend a little bit. I think that this is one of them, that we have a natural inclination for all of these things, and they may or may not be connected, right? So, like Scott Atran was saying about all of this, the idea is that all of these pieces, whether they're all one thing within ourselves or whether they're separate things within ourselves, they give us certain motivations toward a lot of different religious beliefs and practices, and not everyone's the same with this, right? But there is sort of a desire within a lot of people, most people probably, to pursue some of these religious feelings. And people, people find those religious feelings in different ways. I think, most of the people at the Tri-Faith congregations find that through a pursuing of God and communities and sometimes beyond that, right? Like some people really find that spiritual place in thinking deeply about their connection to the world's humans. All right, so let's see, I missed a chat here. Religion is religion another way to make sense of the world? Science explains something to us. Religion adds another perspective. Yes, I agree. I think that religion serves a lot of roles. I don't think that we have to make an argument that says religion is one thing. Just like this byproduct versus adaptation. It's not really a versus. It's it can be both. It can be neither. This is one approach. This isn't the whole answer. This only answers or even provides answers for a few questions regarding religion. Theory of mind. I would probably say Scott Atran is a good choice for that. There's a wide variety. It's a pretty commonly cited theory in evolutionary psychology. And that's really fundamentally about agents, deities, things like that. So we're also going to talk about myths and memeplexes. Now that sounds silly. And I will be clear that, this was originally founded by one of the most famous atheists in the country. right? Richard Dawkins is infamous. Now, I think he founded something very interesting and very beautiful, and came to the conclusions that are overly harsh and not really true to very many people's experience. So I also am bringing up Sue Blackmore with this also, who used to be a little more like Richard Dawkins and has changed her mind a little bit. So this is really fundamentally about those religious stories. And so, and I'll tell you what Richard Dawkins says, and I'll kind of go into different ways to look at it too. So Richard Dawkins, he primarily looks at, so firstly, he does not like religion. Okay, he thinks it's a very important part of how societies are structured. And he really puts the cornerstone on religion around the idea that people share stories, right? People share myths, or however they may be, religious stories. So these religious stories, in his view, come from a long time ago, where I'll give you a little story to kind of explain it, because I think that's the easiest way. So man number one goes out hunting, tens of thousands of years ago, and he brings back a large elk. Okay, and everyone loves him for it, and he does that, and he tells a story about how he hunted this elk, right? Now, and then man number two sees this situation and says, wow, I need to go hunt too. I really want some of this attention. So he goes out. He doesn't find anything, but on his way back, he trips and scrapes his knee and hurts his arm. And when he's asked what happened, he's able to basically say a story of how he got hurt. There was this rock golem that I ran into. That's why I have pebbles in my skin, right? And and eventually, some of these stories end up passing on to future generations. So this both men will reproduce, will continue their own communities, and they will their descendants will talk about those stories with future people. My father got the greatest elk ever, right? Or my father defeated a rock golem. So the idea would be that certain stories, whether they are the first one or the second one, would be passed on and grow and become important cultural stories for large groups of people. And that's, to Richard Dawkins, where the origin of religious stories generally come from. Now, there's definitely exceptions to that, and there's definitely a leaning on very ancient stories for that, but that is his main approach. So he calls these stories a meme, which we use today with internet jokes, right? Because they take an organic nature, and we know this from many religions, maybe not all. Many religions are passed on orally, right? We pass on these stories, and often the core of the story is not so much about the absolute facts, the exact details, that whether exactly how large the elk was, right, or whether it actually was a rock golem or not. It's more about, why does it matter, right? Religious stories really speak to why. It's more about the moral of the story. It's always more about the moral of the story. The events may have taken place exactly as said, They may have modified over time, but the moral of the story is what counts. And yeah, so the idea of that. The other piece that he adds is, does religion itself evolve? I mean, does anyone want to respond to that? Does religion evolve? Do religions evolve? Does your religion evolve? However you might like to respond to that, that'd be.
I think they do.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, like with everything else, they almost have to. It becomes a kind of evolve or go extinct.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, if you look at the history of, in particular, Christianity, all the different splits, and even today, all the different denominations, it's just that particular faith evolving in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would anyone else like to add? Yeah.
I think people evolve,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore ideas bring along evolving religions then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a valid way to look at it too. And this is me just talking about what Dawkins says, which I like I said, is not all, it's not all bad at its core. It's just he just brings it to what he considers, a very fundamentalist atheism. Honestly, he's very fundamentalist about his atheism. But his basic theory is that religions that survive long term have either have certain traits that make them more reproducible, or they gain traits that make them more reproducible. So the idea that like trying to give a good example, but any of our religions on the Tri-Faith Commons speak to something in people that allow them to continue on. They've all been around for a long time, right? Just from like a really practical sense, they have something that allows them to be taken up by people of the future, or other people right now. So he would say, to some extent, yes, they have to, because that's how things last through the generations. Now, this is a little bit of a side note, but related. So there's a Jewish philosopher named Walter Benjamin. I don't know if anybody here has heard of him. He does a lot with art, and and he was a German Jewish guy, lived in France in the really beginnings of the Nazi era. And his basic life story is he knew that Hitler's rise to power was going to be really bad. He was pretty suicidal right when Hitler was elected, and but he lived a couple extra years after that, and wrote a book called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. That sounds complicated, but I'll get back to that in a second. And he ended up trying to go to the United States in 1940. And when he got to Spain, which was where they were going to fly from, the Spanish police took his refugee group, and Walter Benjamin died by suicide. But his suicide actually changed the opinion of the police that were with that refugee group and allowed them to leave to America. So he did not survive, but the rest of the refugee group did. Now, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction basically argues that art was not art right away. Art was religion first. So you think about what the purpose of art is, and how it might have changed over time. At the very beginnings of art, you would make one thing right in front of you, right? And it probably honestly was made out of something that was not expected to last that long, whether it was sand or pebbles or flour-based paints. They knew that those things weren't going to last very long. So the idea would be that you do this to some extent as a sacrifice, if you will, toward religion or community, however you want to think about it. So you would knowingly make art for a short amount of time, that it would not last, and it would only be seen by a few people, really. By and large, obviously there's exceptions, but that's the majority. Now, Walter Benjamin argues that the purpose of art dramatically changed in the Industrial Revolution. It totally changed what the purpose of art was, for better or for worse. And he argued that it was both. He thought it was both good and bad. That art became propaganda. And not in a negative word way, but the idea that art is designed to be mass reproduced, to bring an idea to really as many people as possible most of the time. Now he was saying that really both, to some extent, the Nazi Party was using art as propaganda, but also that the way to fight Nazi propaganda was with their own art, right? That being able to sort of be in that competition, and really try to beat out Nazi propaganda with better propaganda toward good things, was the way to go. So now we're getting close to the end, and I would like any discussion or questions or comments. Was this helpful? Was this something that should be talked about again? Or what did you like or dislike about this? And we'll do a bit of a recap too, while you're thinking about that, actually. So what I'd like you to leave with is that science and religion can complement or conflict with each other. That an important function of religion has been to connect people beyond their immediate kin. That doesn't mean that that's the entire purpose of religion, but one important one is to build that community and beyond that immediate community. And then this can show us some level of universality to religious feelings and religious motivations, as well as the conclusion is not the approach. So what I mean by that is Richard Dawkins, I'm not a fan of. His conclusion is not what I'm a fan of. But I think that maybe it's good to think about stories as memes sometimes, right? Some stories are kind of like that. Or many of these other ones, at first they seem deeply challenging, but then when you think about them, maybe they're not quite so, they're not tied into the conclusion the same way as maybe even their founders thought they would be. So yeah. So the four main books I used for this presentation are probably the top three are my three favorite. So Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction is less about evolutionary psychology. It's more about like art and propaganda. In God's We Trust is, I think I have it actually somewhere here, but it's a little more academic, but it does an overview of a lot of what I said today, not the meme part, but a lot of what I said today. Talking to the Enemy, Scott Atran actually interviewed a lot of Taliban members to try to learn about, what is the motivation behind joining terrorist groups, right? And his basic conclusion was that people have such a deep desire to be part of a community, and especially a community that's part of a grand narrative, that ISIS, for example, would say that they're part of this grand religious history, to a dangerous extent, maybe. It can be used for both good and bad, right? We can see why people might be attracted to certain fundamentalist approaches from any religious background, if we know that we have that deep desire for community and positive things. There's a point where if that's not provided, people will find it where they need to. Right? It's a need for humans to be in community. Darwin's Cathedral is also a great book. David Sloan Wilson is really interesting. He also wrote the Does Altruism Exist? Both are good books. He also has, I think both of them have some podcasts too. So I would like to, again, ask if anybody would like any questions or anything along those lines. Okay, so Pam says would like more time. Yeah. And if there's any of the sections that we've talked about that you'd like to go in a little deeper, I can probably do that a little bit right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the art, and I may not just be understanding the concept you were talking about, but I'm equating that with music and thinking how in the beginning of art and music, I think a lot of it expressed emotion, expressed beliefs. Just as a musician, I'll speak for me. There are times when I felt like God was coming through me in that music. It wasn't me producing it. It was something that I just enjoyed feeling. And then you get to more commercial stuff that isn't so spiritual. It's just play the right notes at the right time. Or with the art, the commercial use of art, it's a different thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I don't think we have completely lost, the original purpose of art. I think it's harder to keep a hold of though today. I think of every time that I do anything artistic, I'm like, okay, where am I going to sell this, publish this, whatever it is, right? That's the first thought. And I'm not even going to start the art unless I have a plan for that. And I think a lot of people are like that, which is my own issue. But I think that is a good explanation for why we feel that way a little bit. But I'm glad that you were able to find some ability to lean into kind of the original purpose of art. Let's see. Okay, so the spandrel, just to kind of explain the spandrel one more time here. So the idea is that there are, so for example, when we're talking about theory of mind, so the idea would be that belief in a deity is not any of these genes. You don't automatically believe in a deity necessarily when you are born. This is their thesis, right? the idea is that you believe in agency behind natural events. You also seek to understand that which is hard to understand, and you also are trying to find some kind of meaning to life, especially as we start to move away from just trying to survive, as humanity moves away from that. So what is found in between those is a God, or really a lot of religion in that approach. That's the idea behind it. I think it can be very beautiful, and it can be a little frustrating too, to be honest. but I think it's interesting regardless. I also wanted to add that. So part of why I like this is because I've done research on white supremacist groups, and Scott Atran's Talking to the Enemy. It has so much overlap. When somebody is outcasted in any capacity, well, even if it's for good reasons, there's good reasons to outcast somebody. It tends to force them to find what is the community that will still accept me, right? So because they're not going to just accept being alienated completely. Honestly, the people who commit lone wolf terrorism by like white supremacists and stuff, they are part of groups, they're part of communities. They're not totally by themselves. They just establish online communities, or they understand or they believe they have certain communities that are mostly imagined. Like I've mentioned before, I think that a lot of white supremacists see themselves as fighting for white people, but most white people wouldn't agree with that. But it's an imagined community that they are willing to sacrifice their lives for, right? So the approach kind of gives us a little bit of language to think, or an approach to think about why do terrible acts happen. So, and I don't mean like all, this isn't all bad by any means. This can be good or bad. And we know that about, about religion in general, I would say, right? We have, religion can be very wonderful, and it should be. But there's also people who take it to a bad direction. And this starts to explain why either way is okay with some people. Let's see.
Jeremy?
Yeah.
I've got a question. This
Yeah.
is Bill Roberts.
Mhm.
I'm wondering about, there's something in one of your very last slides about an important function of religion is to connect people beyond their immediate kin.
Right.
I would say that's true up to a point.
Okay.
I think it's also an important function of religion, seems to me, to be saying there is a point you don't go beyond.
Yeah.
And I think it can create hostilities beyond that point.
I think that's valid. I think that his approach would say that also. So, or at least Scott Atran would probably say that. He would say that the protection of a community is from an enemy, right? You don't need protection if everybody's part of your community. But why do you need a community if you don't need protection? It's kind of a cycle, but yeah, I mean, and some, like I said, some religions see, or some people, maybe that's probably the better word, see other people as enemy. Some people have learned to see, ideas or actions or something like that as enemy too, right? They've changed what the thing is of that they need safety from, right? So rather than it being about trying to think here, I don't know, like we don't, it's kind of like changing it between murderers and murder, right? Murder is the problem. Murderers, I think a lot of people don't think of murderers themselves as an enemy. You know, they see what is promoting, or what is getting people to murder, right? I think that we've started to learn how to make the enemy less permanent and less tribal. That's my opinion. I'm just throwing stuff out there. I think you have a good point, and it's just making me think a little bit. So. But yeah, I think yeah. If anybody else has any questions, we can definitely discuss. I'm glad you have liked it. Oh, I do want to share the survey here. If you're able to take that, I would really appreciate it. Or, do you have it up, Sierra? Here, I'll grab it. But you know, also I want to ask, what would you like to see in future Abraham's Whiteboard programs? Are there certain topics you wish that we would cover? Would you? I'd like to have more guests too, but still would want to know what you all would like for topics.
This is Kathy. I think, as someone suggested, more in-depth about this topic would be good.
Okay.
And just about belief systems in general, what motivates people, would be interesting to me. And just a side comment on the evolution of religion. What about the idea that the Tri-Faith Initiative itself is an indication of an evolution?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Revolution, maybe, right? You know, because going back, I remember my father, he went to this church in Wisconsin, and he said, oh, and there's another, so why is there another Catholic church right across the street? He said, well, that was the Irish church. You know, like going back not that far in the past, it wasn't even that you weren't, you know, of that specific religion, you were from a different country even, and that separated people. So I think there's been evolution in that sense of
Right.
people accepting each other from different faiths, and also even just within different religious groups.